There exists an ancient illusion, as old as human greed itself, that whispers in our ears the promise of instantaneous transformation. It is the belief that we can, through some secret knowledge or hidden ritual, transmute the ordinary into the extraordinary, the base into the precious, time into irrelevance. This is the shadow that has loomed over all speculative markets since the dawn of commercial civilization. It is not simply the pursuit of wealth that consumes us, but something deeper and more dangerous. The psychological need to believe we have discovered the shortcut that others have failed to see. The story I share today does not take place in the digital forums of our era, though it could. It belongs to a time when alchemy was the cryptocurrency of its age, where men devoted entire lifetimes to the pursuit of the philosopher's stone, that mythical substance capable of converting lead into gold. But this fable is not really about alchemy or cryptocurrencies. It is about the cognitive bias that behavioral psychologists call epistemic overconfidence, combined with the hot hand fallacy and the disposition effect. It is about the illusion that we are capable of seeing patterns where only chaos exists, that our intuition transcends statistical reality, that this time will be different. Let me take you now to a forgotten tower, where the shadows are long and human ambition is longer still. In a medieval city whose name has been erased by time, there lived a man known only as the Alchemist. His tower rose above other structures like an accusing finger pointed at the heavens, its narrow windows casting pale light onto the cobblestone streets below. He was not a common charlatan. He had studied in the most remote monasteries, deciphered manuscripts in dead languages, mastered the hermetic arts that separated true practitioners from mere potion sellers. His reputation extended across 3 kingdoms. Nobles sought him for elixirs. Merchants offered fortunes for his consultations. But the alchemist refused them all, for he was obsessed with a singular project, the creation of the philosopher's stone, the secret of perfect transmutation. The scene is bathed in shadows and crosshatched lines, his laboratory filled with twisted alembics and yellowed scrolls, every surface covered with the patina of obsession. For years he experimented, mercury and sulfur, salt and vitriol, infinite combinations under specific lunar phases, pronouncing invocations in Aramaic and ancient Greek. And then, on a stormy night, when thunder shook the foundations of his tower, something extraordinary happened. One of his mixtures began to glow with an ethereal silver light. The liquid boiled and transformed, emitting iridescent vapors that danced in the air like spirits. The alchemist, with trembling hands, poured the substance over a piece of lead, and before his eyes, the metal began to change. Its gray surface acquired a golden sheen. Not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably there was a transformation. This is the critical moment in our story, the inflection point where psychology separates from reason. The alchemist had achieved something remarkable, but not what he sought. The process was unstable, the result impure, the conversion rate minimal. A true scientist would have recognized this as a preliminary step, a hint that he was on the right path, but still far from his goal. He would have carefully documented the conditions, attempted to replicate the experiment, submitted his findings to the scrutiny of other masters. But the human mind does not function this way when under the spell of confirmation bias. The alchemist saw only what he wanted to see: gold. Not the partially altered lead, not the evidence of an incomplete process, but proof that he, and only he, had unlocked the universal secret. News of his discovery spread, as all news of financial miracles inevitably spreads, first whispered in taverns, then discussed in merchant halls, finally shouted in market squares. The alchemist had transmuted metals. The alchemist had discovered the secret. The alchemist was creating wealth from nothing. And as in all speculative cycles throughout human history, from Dutch tulip mania to the dot-com bubbles, the crowd began to gather. They knocked on his door with bags of silver coins, begging to invest in his process. They offered properties, titles, entire inheritances, anything for the privilege of participating in this alchemical revolution. The alchemist, inflated by external validation, began to accept their funds. He was not, understand well, consciously trying to deceive anyone. This is the crucial distinction between a fraudster and a victim of one's own cognitive bias. He genuinely believed he had solved the enigma. Each new investor was, in his mind, simply someone wise enough to recognize his genius. With this influx of capital, the alchemist expanded his operations. He hired assistants. He acquired rare materials from distant lands. He built larger furnaces, more complex alembics, entire laboratories dedicated to replicating that stormy night. But here is the cruel irony that defines all speculative markets. The more resources he applied, the more desperately he tried to replicate his initial success, the more distant true transmutation seemed to become. Subsequent experiments failed. The silver glow did not return. Lead remained lead, indifferent to his invocations and mixtures. Behavioral psychology identifies this phenomenon as the sunk cost fallacy. The alchemist had invested so much, not only in terms of resources but in terms of personal identity, that admitting failure became psychologically impossible. He was the man who discovered transmutation. This became the foundation of his being. To give up now would mean not only losing money, but destroying the narrative he had built about himself. So he began to create demonstrations, carefully choreographed performances where, under controlled conditions and with dramatic lighting, he appeared to transmute metals before amazed audiences. They were tricks, naturally, skillful substitutions, pre-prepared alloys that changed color under heating. But the alchemist had crossed a dangerous psychological boundary. He began to believe in his own performances. This is the final stage of self-deception. When the line between the illusion we create for others and the reality we experience internally dissolves completely. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance resolved through reality distortion. It is the same mechanism that allows bankrupt fund managers to continue believing in their strategies, compulsive gamblers to see patterns in random outcomes, Ponzi scheme investors to defend their fraudsters even after arrest. The investors, however, began to demand results. Where was the promised gold? When would their silver and properties return multiplied? The alchemist calmed them with complex technical explanations. The process, he explained, required time. Astral influences needed to align. Superior quality mercury was in transit from India. Just a few more months, he assured them, and everyone would be rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. This is the universal language of collapsing speculative markets, technical complexity used as a smokescreen. Promises of extraordinary gains always deferred to a near but never present future. The invocation of uncontrollable external factors to explain delays. The parallels with failed cryptocurrency project announcements are so precise they become predictable. The difference between a 2017 white paper promising to revolutionize the global financial system and a 14th century alchemical manuscript promising universal transmutation is purely cosmetic. The psychological mechanisms are identical. Eventually, like all speculative bubbles, the illusion began to shatter. One particularly persistent investor demanded to see the complete records of the experiments. Another hired his own alchemist to evaluate the process. The cracks in the narrative became fissures. The fissures became chasms. The crowd that had celebrated the alchemist as a visionary genius now turned against him with the particular fury reserved for those who make us confront our own credulity. Because, understand, they were not really furious with him for failing. They were furious with themselves for believing, and that internal anger is always projected externally. The tower was invaded, the laboratories ransacked, the scrolls burned in the streets. The alchemist fled in the darkness of night, carrying only that first piece of partially transmuted metal, that ambiguous evidence of his only genuine success. He lived his final years in complete anonymity, in a remote village where no one knew his story. And every night, by candlelight, he examined that fragment of metal, turning it between his fingers, trying to remember how he had succeeded. Had it been real? Had it been an illusion? From the beginning, he could no longer distinguish. His mind, once so brilliant, had become prisoner of its own need to believe. The object he held might have been a natural alloy of lead and tin, something common enough in metal mines. Or it might have genuinely been something extraordinary, a chemical phenomenon he would never be able to replicate again. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was that he had allowed a single ambiguous observation to transform into absolute certainty. And that certainty had destroyed not only his fortune, but his sanity. This fable is not about alchemy. It is about what behavioral economists identify as a cluster of mutually reinforcing cognitive biases. First, there is confirmation bias, our tendency to value evidence that confirms our existing beliefs while discarding contradictory evidence. The alchemist saw what he wanted to see in that first partial transmutation. Second, there is epistemic overconfidence, our inclination to overestimate the precision of our knowledge and judgment. He believed his initial success represented complete mastery, when in fact it represented a possibly random or misunderstood outcome. Third, there is the hot hand fallacy, the belief that past successes increase the probability of future successes, when in truly random or highly complex systems, past events do not predict future events. Finally, there is the disposition effect, our reluctance to realize losses, our tendency to hold losing investments too long while selling winners too soon. The cryptocurrency market of recent decades has demonstrated each of these biases on a global scale. Individuals who acquired Bitcoin or Ethereum in the early days frequently attributed their success to superior perception or technical understanding, when in many cases it was simply a combination of risk appetite and timing. This erroneous attribution of causality led many to invest in hundreds of subsequent projects with the same confidence, believing they had discovered a formula for identifying winners. Projects with elaborate white papers and grandiose promises attracted billions in investments, not based on economic fundamentals, but on the seductive narrative of technological revolution. The technical complexity of blockchain technology served the same purpose as the alchemist's Latin invocations, to create a curtain of obscurity through which speculation could be confused with insight. When these projects inevitably failed to fulfill impossible promises, investors faced the same psychological dilemma as the alchemist. Admit the error or double down. The sunk cost fallacy ensured that many chose the latter. Entire communities formed around failed cryptocurrencies, each member reinforcing the other's belief that success was always just one technical development away. This is the power of group confirmation bias. When surrounded by others who share our illusion, the illusion comes to seem like reality. The online forums of these projects became digital echoes of the alchemist's tower, each participant presenting increasingly elaborate interpretations of why failure was actually delayed success. The true tragedy is not that people lose money in speculation. Financial losses are recoverable. The true tragedy is the destruction of the capacity for rational discernment. Once we allow wishful thinking to replace objective analysis, once we learn to reinterpret evidence to fit the narrative we desire, we compromise our ability to navigate any complex domain of reality. The alchemist in his final years was no longer capable of evaluating any phenomenon scientifically. Everything became potentially magical, potentially the key to transmutation. His mind had been retrained to see patterns where none existed, to believe in impossible causalities, to reject uncomfortable evidence. There is a profound irony in the fact that alchemy, through its failure, eventually gave birth to modern chemistry. It was the alchemists who developed techniques of distillation, crystallization, and separation that became fundamental to science. But this transition was only possible when practitioners abandoned the quest for magical transmutation and embraced the empirical method: careful observation, replicable experiments, willingness to accept negative results. Cryptocurrency, similarly, may have legitimate applications in distributed ledger technology, but these applications will only be realized when the community abandons the quasi-religious narratives of instantaneous financial revolution and adopts sober practices of technological development. The difference between speculation and investment is not the asset in question, but the mental process employed. Speculation is cognitive alchemy, the belief that we can transmute our ignorance into knowledge through force of will. Investment is cognitive chemistry, the recognition that real understanding requires patient work, healthy skepticism, and humble acceptance of our own fallibility. So, what is the lesson we should extract from this fable? It is not that all innovation is suspect, or that all emerging markets are frauds. The lesson is more subtle and more important. It is that our greatest enemy in financial decision-making is not the external volatility of the market, but the internal volatility of our own psychology. It is that the same mental mechanism that allows us to recognize genuine patterns and make creative connections also makes us vulnerable to seeing patterns in random noise. It is that confidence, that quality we admire and cultivate, can easily metastasize into arrogance that blinds us to our own ignorance. It is that the narrative we tell about ourselves, our identity as perceptive investors or financially sophisticated individuals, can become a psychological prison that prevents us from adapting our beliefs in the face of new evidence. The alchemist was not destroyed by his ambition. Ambition is neutral, neither virtuous nor vicious in itself. He was destroyed by his inability to distinguish between the appearance of understanding and genuine understanding, between justified confidence and comfortable illusion. He was destroyed ultimately by his resistance to admitting three fundamental words for any honest intellectual endeavor: I don't know. Each of us carries a piece of transmuted metal in our minds, some belief about our financial acuity based on a past success or a partial observation. And each of us faces the same choice the alchemist faced: to examine that success with critical eyes, to seek alternative explanations, to test our hypotheses against brutal reality, or to wrap it in layers of rationalization and build our identities on foundations of sand. The true transmutation is not converting lead into gold. It is converting conscious ignorance into humble knowledge, converting unfounded confidence into constructive skepticism, converting comfortable narratives into uncomfortable but accurate understanding. This is the real philosopher's stone, not an external substance we can acquire or discover, but an internal discipline we must practice continuously. It does not promise instant wealth. It promises something more valuable: the ability to navigate uncertainty without self-deception, to participate in markets without becoming slaves to our own illusions, to pursue returns without sacrificing our cognitive integrity. The alchemist never found that philosopher's stone, but you still can. It is available to anyone willing to pay its price: the death of the infallible investor ego, the end of the fantasy of having discovered what others have missed, the acceptance that in the vast complexity of financial markets, we are all perpetual students, never masters. If these fables resonate with truths you recognize in your own financial journey, subscribe to discover the hidden lessons that history has to teach us about money, mind, and the eternal dance between fear and greed that defines the human condition. Each video is an archaeological excavation into the ruins of past financial mistakes, seeking not the gold of easy certainty, but the hard-won wisdom that comes only from honestly confronting our own cognitive biases. The alchemist's tower still stands within each of us. The question is whether we will have the courage to examine what we have truly built in its shadows.